drew a story across your skin, collecting snails in the garden till the sunlight starts to dim.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's public lecture from Dr. Alice Motion, who is our guest from the University of Sydney. I'm Karen Thompson. I'm the director of the Consortium for Sexuality, Race, and Public Culture, which is a Mellon-funded initiative here at USC. Our task is to translate our research on gender, sexuality, and race to the public sphere, and we unapologetically and bravely continue to translate our work for the public sphere and to insist upon its existence in public space and public conversation. And we are so very thrilled that you are all joining us here for this conversation today. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you one of the most lauded science communicators I know, Dr. Alice Motion, who is Professor of Science and Culture at the School of Chemistry at the University of Sydney, where they lead the Science Communication Outreach Participation and Education Research Group. It's called SCOPE. Alice's research and practice explores citizens' democratization through open source drug discovery and citizen science, while also exploring intersections between science and culture as creative methods for science communication. Alice was awarded the Australian Museum's Eureka Prize for promoting public understanding of science in 2020. They've written a monthly column called Citizen Chem for Chemistry World magazine since 2018. And they're creator of what we're going to hear a little bit about today, live from the lab, as well as founder of the Breaking Good Citizen Science Initiative, and they regularly also produce and host creative science content for the public in live venues and across the media. And I just wanted to say that as a person who never excelled at science and never wanted to think about it again for very long periods of time, I was really struck the first time I met and encountered Dr. Motion's work at the University of Sydney, at how intrigued I could be again by the periodic table and the poetry it could create. So please warmly welcome Dr. Alice Motion. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Karen, and I'd like to say thank you to Karen and to Hatia and to Sam for making this visit possible and being so welcoming, and all of you for coming. I see a few familiar faces in the audience. I'd also like, before I start sharing the work today, to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Gabrielino Tongva people today, and that the work that I'm going to share with all of you is done, almost all of it's done on the lands of the Gadi people, the Aboriginal traditional owners of the land that the University of Sydney is built on, and that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As a group who have a lot of fun trying to think about sharing science and knowledge, I'm always aware that we're standing on ground where people have been sharing knowledge for at least 65,000 years, most likely much longer. And so we have a lot of responsibility in what we're doing, but also a huge tradition of that too. So thank you so much for hosting me today. And Karen has mentioned a little bit about the group that I lead, and I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. But I am in the School of Chemistry. I'm trained as a chemist, but we've been doing lots of work in trying to think about sharing chemistry and science more broadly for many years now. And today I'm going to be focusing on some of the work that we've done in terms of music and sound. And really, the origins of this work is because I am an audiophile, a bit of a radio nut. So I grew up in the UK. An Uber driver this morning asked me if I was Australian, so obviously something is changing about my accent, but I'm from the northwest of England. My parents were and are avid listeners to Radio 4, and the first noise that would happen in the morning was my dad putting the radio on, and it would be on throughout the day, all the way in the car to school, all of the evening. And so I think a lot of the information that I took in as a child was through osmosis. And I really feel that sound, music, radio, audio is how I make a lot of sense of the world, even now. I was lucky when I came to Sydney that I got involved with working with volunteering with a local community radio station, FBI Radio, no relation to the FBI over here. And I presented a weekly segment on science for about 5 years called Up an Atom, where I talk about some up-and-coming science. And the person who's shown on this slide here, this is Sean Conran, or Obscura Hale. He's now moved to Melbourne, but he's from Wollongong, a town that's a couple of hours, an hour and a half south of Sydney. And he's a prolific musician and a brilliant songwriter. And I got to know him through a friend. We were having a beer one day and he said, I'd write a song for one of your science stories and come and play it on the radio. And he did this a couple of times and it really was a really beautiful collaboration. And I always had this sort of thing in my mind, maybe we could make this into something a little bit more or grow this idea. I've also worked on science podcasts, so I'm made together with Bernie Hobbs at the ABC, again the Australian version of the ABC, a podcast called Dear Science, where Bernie and myself took on the role of science agony ants, and we'd find real letters that had been written to agony ants or astrology experts, and we would answer those letters with science and write a letter back from science. And so we've had a lot of fun in this domain. And really it was when COVID-19 hit and the National Science Week in Australia is in August each year, and about 6 weeks out it became really obvious that we weren't going to have in-person events in the same way, and there was a sudden call for some new grants to try and think about how we were going to disseminate science during this week when there was social distancing. And I thought, a lot of people were moving to things like Zoom and thinking about webcasting content, and I suddenly thought, well, the radio's been doing a pretty good job of transmitting information for over distance for a long time. And so I was able to win a small amount of funding from the National Science Week grant and to propose something to FBI Radio, which was called Live from the Lab. And this is the result of some funding from Sydney Nano, which is a multidisciplinary institute at the University of Sydney, and also some National Science Week funding and the willing participation of a really interdisciplinary team of different scholars. So the top row, the first four people were the people who applied for the grant. So there's a person from Museum and Heritage Studies, me from Chemistry, Danny from the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, and Nazim Ahmadpour from the School of Architecture and Design. And then we're joined by Cass, who's helped us to put on all of Live from the Lab and is one of my closest collaborators, and she's a professional staff member at the University of Sydney. And then you'll be introduced a little bit more to Alexis Weaver, who's an acousmatic an electronic sound artist and composer, and also a PhD student in our group, as well as a lecturer at Sydney Conservatorium. Jen Firma, who's a PhD student in our group, who's a resting high school chemistry teacher who's come to do a PhD. I don't know if that's a rest, but she's in our group too. JD O'Regan, who's a wonderful academic at the Con, somebody who writes a lot about pop music, and if you haven't come across her work, I really encourage you to take a look. Olivia, who's a PhD student, and Daniel Blinkhorn, who's also at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. So this group of people got together and have been working on various forms of thinking about how to talk about science, originally nanoscience, because that's where our funding came from, to the public, but using music. And the two projects that I'm going to mainly focus on today are Live from the Lab, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, which is much more of a sort of affective or emotional connection between scientists and musicians, and the Sonaphor, which we're really thinking of as a bit more of a pedagogical tool and a way to construct meaning and understanding of scientific concepts. So, Live from the Lab, which I've sort of introduced to you. The song that you heard as we were sort of coming into the room today was a song called Curiosity, which was created by the all-women Sydney band Megafauna, who write a lot about megafauna and about nature. They're a wonderful group of musicians. And they were paired with Associate Professor Tanya Latty, who's just in the corner here, on one of these COVID time Zoom screenshots. This is Courtney Ammenhauser, who is the radio presenter at FBI Radio. And this is typical of the first couple of iterations of Live from the Lab that happened during COVID. So what we were able to do with about 5 or 6 different scientists each year, we paired them with local musicians, often up-and-coming artists, musicians that were part of the playlist on FBI radio, so we knew that they would appeal to the audience there, and we had a lot of advice from the music curation team. We were able to pair them with researchers from the University of Sydney. We had some funding to pay the artists too, which was particularly important at that time when all gigs were off. And I facilitated just one conversation for a maximum of 90 minutes between the musicians and the scientists, and tried to make sure that everyone got equal time and there was time to talk about the research, but also to get to know each other as much as you can in 90 minutes. But I think the results show that you can really build a relationship in that time. And then the musicians had a really short period of time, typically a month, to create a brand new musical track that was inspired in some way by the conversation that they'd had on the Zoom. And they were encouraged not to get back in touch with the scientists, but really to take something of what they had felt during that experience and what they wanted to share. And then what we did is, when it got to Science Week, each morning of National Science Week, we all Zoomed in to be on the radio, and we had a conversation with a mic break for the song. And on one side of the song, we talked a little bit more about sort of the musician and their practice. On the other side, we talked a little bit more about the science that was being created and the process of the pairing and how the music had come about. And I think what was very special about the project is that as the radio audience heard the track for the first time, that was also the first time that the scientist was hearing the music that had been composed for them. And what we noticed was, certainly from me, I'm a bit of an emotional person as in any kind of time, and I think COVID we were a little bit more heightened too. But it was really a very touching experience, and often some of that emotion or the idea of being given a gift, a song about your research or about your story, was really something that was very touching for the scientists, and something that the audience really enjoyed hearing together with the scientists. Now, as we've moved forward and we're able to gather again, we've been able to put on some fantastic public events around this format as we've commissioned more researchers and artist partnerships over the years. So I think we're up to 17 new musical tracks now, so 17 partnerships. We've got one vinyl record with a limited press that we've been able to create, and hopefully some more to come. But what we've been able to put on is an in-conversation event in a local theatre, so off the Sydney University campus. And during this event, I said to Cass, who you met before, Cass Chester, can we make it a little bit like Graham Norton? You know, something that's a really kind of friendly, chatty environment. And we brought on different pairs of musicians and artists at different times, chatted to them about the process. We listened to the track. We either listened to the recorded track together with the audience, and we had a few live performances that were stripped down and pared back to be sort of suitable for that venue. And it was really fantastic to have these conversations in front of a theatre audience and to hear more from the musicians and the scientists. And I think what came about and came out of these things is that it's a very tired idea, but it's something that's still out there, this idea that art and science are somehow at odds. And I don't like to give it too much time because I don't think it's true at all. But really is that the similarities in the creativity and the processes and some of the differences were really quite fascinating at how people came about their composition and how different that was for each individual musician. Some people sort of viewed it as a sort of problem solving. For other artists, it's a completely different process too. And then as a separate event, we had a gig that was held in Manning Bar, which is quite a famous gig venue on the University of Sydney campus. And in this event, it was all of this was like pulled over and focused on the musicians. So they each played a short set, I should say, and featured the only thing they had to do was to play their Live from the Lab song as part of their set and introduce it in any way that they wanted to do so. And this event really meant that we could advertise a gig with some bands known to students and other members of the community, draw them in to come and see the music, and then have a little bit of science on the side. And similarly for the In Conversation event, perhaps a little bit more of a science-focused audience came to those events. But equally, might have been encouraged to go to the music event afterwards. And what's been great is that we've had many different genres covered. So we've had some soul music, had some R&B, electronic, sort of heavier forms of sort of heavier electronic music, some with very little vocal or lyrics, and there's been a real mixture in the partnerships. And something that's been quite special is how the partnerships seem to have worked so well, and you always wonder, was that the ideal partnership? You know, were we just lucky, or was it just that these people were so responsive and receptive to this project that any pairing would have resulted in something equally beautiful? So this has been a beautiful project, and I'm going to play you a little bit of a clip from another band who participated in the project. This band is Baby Beef, and this song is called Golden Trauma. I'll just play a little snippet, but if you want to hear more afterwards, please let me know and I can share any of the songs with you. But this is composed and created in collaboration with my colleague in the School of Chemistry, Dr. Jonathan Dannon. And one of the things that John looks at is how to create medicines that can access and get into the brain, because the brain is designed to stop things from getting in there, which is good for us in general. But if you have a disease of the brain or some sort of pathology, then we need the medicines to be able to get through the blood-brain barrier and access the place that they need to be. So here's a little bit of Golden Trauma.
Oh, I never told myself to breathe. I guess I never felt the need, but something's telling me to breathe. Through the cracks in my skin, letting half the world in, and the other half is waiting. So patiently, they're telling me it's gonna be a little while longer. It took a billion years just to get me here, and the pain is only making me stronger.
Okay, so I'll stop that there, but if you want to hear more later, you're very welcome to. I should add that only some of the musicians have made film clips for the music, and really this was done in 1 year when we thought we were going to be able to have a live event, but as we all remember, sometimes all bets were off when it came to COVID-19, and so we asked people if we could repurpose some of the grant, and if they wanted to create these musical clips they could do. And some of these were done at physical distance from each other too, so they were pretty creative in terms of how they were making those video clips too. So we have a research project that we are preparing a publication on where some of the participants have been interviewed. So I'll send that to Karen or Atia when it's out. But I just took a couple of clips and I've very crudely kind of paired them with the beaker for the scientist and the musical notes for the musician. But one of the things that came out of this was the importance of creativity. So, scientists' perspectives of science as an art, and musicians' perspectives of seeing the geometry in music, which again, I know these are concepts that come up and that many of you will be familiar with, but it's just interesting to hear this from the voices of the participants. And I think one of the things that was really meaningful for me was the strong emotional connection. So we can hear in somebody else's own voice about thinking about how they felt when they heard this song for the first time, and how much effort had been put into this composition and just how special that meant. And I guess that's not so surprising. There's not too many of us who've had a song written about us or our work. We can but dream of those days. And then in terms of the musician, just thinking that the prompt or the opportunity to be part of a project where you were given sort of a subject, a task to write about, and to write about something that was bigger than just them was something they found really meaningful and that they really enjoyed. So it's a project that I've really enjoyed doing too, and I'm looking forward to returning to it pretty soon. We have had one crossover into a non-scientist or engineer, which has been a fantastic thing to do, and that's what we'd like to do now, is to I think with the work in our group, we focus on science because that's my home discipline, but I'm really interested in research translation in all of its forms. And I think one of the things that we talk about a lot in the sciences or STEM fields is the complexities of communicating STEM topics to the public, but I would argue that they're no more challenging than any other discipline. I think that's a bit of I don't think that that's true at all. So I think if we think about how we're going to explain our research and why we're doing that, there's strong potential to use music or sound for different fields too. So I'm going to switch up a little bit to move to talking about the Sonaphor. And before I do that, I thought only right to play at least a snippet of really the piece of sound that gave me this idea. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Radiolab podcast, but this is one that I've listened to a lot over many years. And there was one day, it was in, I don't know if it was on June the 6th, 2015, but I think it was in 2015. And as a science communicator, I'm trying to broadly read about things that are happening in science because I often speak to topics that are not directly in my own discipline. And I was sort of, I've been thinking about CRISPR and thinking about talking about gene editing. And I was listening to this podcast one day, and I realized that as I heard this piece of sound, the concept clicked for me in a way that it hadn't with merely the diagrams or the pictures that I've been looking at in papers. So I might just play a little bit of this for you now, and I hope that you can hear this. So this is a snippet from Radiolab.
They found this really strange stretch of DNA.
Strange how?
Well, so basically what it was 5 identical sequences in a row. And then they were separated by very short sequences in between them that were all different from each other.
These little blurps, so it'd be like...
And they looked at this and they're like, what? This is nothing like we've seen before.
Repeated sequences in bacterial.
Okay, so the last voice that you heard there is Nobel Prize winner Professor Jennifer Doudna, who, as you'll know, Radiolab are great at getting scientific royalty on there too. But it really struck me when I heard this, how rarely, even as somebody who listens to quite a lot of podcasts and science podcasts, how rarely sound is used on the radio or in podcasts to convey meaning. It's almost always used to convey either a sense of place or to give us a sense of emotion. But often, if there's enough budget in our national broadcaster, when there's a scientific concept that comes onto the news, if it's complicated, somebody will have been commissioned to draw a graphic or an animation to assist with our understanding. And I'm sorry to come back to COVID-19 again, but I think we all became pretty familiar with what a spike protein looked like, what mRNA looked like. We could visualize this virus in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have been able to without that artistic rendering. And so it got me thinking, well, why aren't we doing this more with sound? And it's really only wonderful places like Radiolab that seem to be, from their long list of contributors each episode, more well-resourced than typical, than other podcasts seem to be able to do this. And we thought, could we create something that would help to guide understanding of scientific concepts but using sound? And so we started working on this with a working name of a sound diagram, thinking about taking a scientific concept, thinking about how we could illustrate this with sound. And perhaps we could create something that might, if we reached our ultimate goal, even help a person to create their own mental model of a concept. Because much of science is taught through models, and like every model, they all have flaws, they're models. So would it be something that might even be able to build a greater understanding or a different understanding if a person could create their own sense of a concept? We later learned that sound diagram meant something specific in terms of accessibility, and we didn't want to conflate that. Although we hope that this could be a tool for accessibility, we didn't want to break any of the rules of this concept. And we thought about the aspects that we want to incorporate, which would be sound. We also decided that dialogue was very important, or at least some form of speech, because the sounds on their own without a description might not mean anything, and that we could use some elements of music in there too. And so we thought, because we're thinking about a story in terms of this, maybe we'll go for a sonic metaphor or a sonaphor. And so that's what we've decided to call our creation. We started with chemistry because, as I've shared with you all, that's my home discipline. And we thought, why don't we map some of these concepts to dot points in the high school science syllabus to see if we could really try and teach some of those aspects. And I'll just borrow these different models of water to try and explain this concept. So all of these, ignore this one for a second, the first three are all depictions of water. And they tell us different things. So the first one in the left-hand corner tells us something about the bond angles between these atoms. It also conveys the difference in size between oxygen and hydrogen. It tells us something about the electronegativity, that oxygen is pulling more of its electron density towards it. The next doesn't really show us too much difference in the size of hydrogen and oxygen, but it's a little bit more 3D. We get a sense of a little bit, a 2D, 3D-ness about this. And this is perhaps, in a way, not that I'm saying it's the best model, but it's most useful because we rarely actually think about one atom of water. We're really thinking about how it relates to each other as molecules. So we're seeing these hydrogen bonds and how the water molecules interact with each other. And more people are working in VR and AR to try and help people to manipulate, I'm just talking about chemistry now, but to think about bonds, to think about bonding, to think about how atoms can come together and make new bonds and create new molecules. But there's still not too much in the sound area. So working together with Alexis, who you've met earlier, who's an amazing sound artist, composer, and Jen, who's an amazing chemistry high school teacher, the three of us came together and thought, could we try and create these? I'll bring some of my chemistry knowledge, and Jen can sort of temper that to make sure it's suitable for the syllabus and for the students listening. And Alexis has this wonderful capability and capacity for creating particularly acousmatic and electronic music. And so that's where these sonaphors have started. So we thought about a few things that we really wanted to do here. One was this idea of mnemonic efficiency, so making sure that the sounds were memorable and that the symbolism of them would be identifiable to an audience. The other was thinking about semiotic efficiency, so thinking about how the purpose of that sound or the symbolism of that sound would be recognizable. And perhaps most important, is the listener going to be engaged? How can we think about creating music or sounds that are interesting to listen to, and what length should each of these be? And I'm going to play, this one is a little bit quiet, but I think our friends are helping us to make the volume a little bit louder. So I ask you to listen to this in the spirit of, this has been designed to be listened to in headphones, so it's not going to come through quite as beautifully as it does with that immersive sound. But this is one that, of the sound diagrams that's voiced, the script is voiced by Alexis, and it's about the atom. And we'll hear a little bit of it. I'm mindful of time, so if Karen gives me a wave, I'll move on and make sure that if anyone wants to listen to these, I can share them with you afterwards.
Everything that we can see and feel is made up of tiny particles called atoms. Yet they are so small that we can't see them. Oh, weird. Scientists have worked for over 2,000 years to understand what's inside them. Want to have a closer look? Let's travel together to the center of an atom. But first, we have to shrink down to size. So hold on tight. Are now floating in the center of an atom. Notice that there's a lot of empty space around us. But flying through that empty space are some tiny particles. And every so often, one zips past. That is an electron. Electrons are the smallest particles inside the atom. They have almost no mass, and they're negatively charged. If we move further into the atom to its very center, we we can see a tight cluster of two different types of particles. This cluster is called the nucleus. Unlike the almost weightless electrons, the two types of particles in the nucleus do have mass. The nucleus is actually the place where virtually all of the atom's mass is. One of these particles are called protons, which are positively charged, and the others are called neutrons, and they have no charge. Over time, our understanding of the atom has advanced. We now know that protons and neutrons are made up of even smaller particles. But our understanding is far from complete. There is still much more for us to understand about the atom, which means there are still many chapters to be written in this story. For now, it's time to zoom back out to a scale that we're more used to. The world we walk through every day. A world that's built from atoms.
So this is one of the chemistry concepts that we've created. And there are a few that are listed in this paper. There's a few different concepts that are under development. We've just been joined in the group by a new master's student, Harry Alexiadis, and Harry is a guitarist and composer. So we're really interested to see how the project might develop with different instruments or different musical styles. And I think one of the things that we're super interested in is thinking about how this might relate to, how this might be used as a tool for accessibility, how it may help students who have neurodivergencies, might be a different way of learning or thinking. And also, I think if we can get some funding, I'm very interested in sort of the cultural context of the sound. So does an electron sound the same to somebody in Japan or somebody in Manchester, or, you know, for want of a better description? So how would we think about that? Something that is constantly in my mind is when I was lucky to learn French at school, and a little bit of Spanish, although that's terrible now, is just the different ways that different languages describe the noises that animals make. And it feels like we're all hearing the same noise, but we must be hearing something different. And of course, there's our linguistic and language differences too, but why is that we don't all recall the same noise for animals that, to me, sound similar around the world? So that's something I'd really love for us to be able to explore. Perhaps some of you have some ideas and might want to talk more about that. I'm going to skip through this a little bit because I think we want to have time for discussion. But I thought I would just move round to one aspect of the script design, which just sort of explains some of the ideas of how we talked through these scripts and how we made changes. So this is me trying to explain, as a non-musician, non-sound artist, to Alexis how I think as a scientist these concepts that should sound to me. So, you know, the electron should sound like zzz, like a light going off in a creepy movie. The proton should be more like the light that's flashing and stranging things when 11 arrives. Boing, warmer and bigger. We can also give proton an echoey thing. The neutron should be more like a snooker ball in the sense of the noise doesn't last. It happens quickly. It's not radiating out at all. The noise is gone and doesn't hang around. It's dull, empty, full, not sure which will sound better. So this is just an example of our kind of ramblings to each other and how we develop some of those sounds. And how, as an interdisciplinary team, we have respect for each other's capacities and knowledges of different disciplines, because sometimes we don't have, you know, the vocabulary or the language to explain things as precisely as we would if we were in a disciplinary context, for example. Sorry, just got a little bit stuck. Okay, so the final thing that I wanted to share with you is we've moved the Sonaphor into a live performance style piece that we've called the Atomic Choir. And we've been really lucky to celebrate this publicly. These are some pictures from the Sydney Observatory during Sydney World Pride during 2023. And what we do in the Atomic Choir is we write a scientific script, but a script that looks a little bit more like a song or a poem, doesn't have to rhyme, but just sort of very simple lines of text that kind of take us through a story. And we invite an audience to create the soundscape that accompanies those texts. And then, much like you would in a choir practice, we sort of rehearse it and then join different aspects together. And then at the end of the evening, we'd give a full performance of the script as the Atomic Choir. And so on this occasion, you'll see that we were hosted by the wonderful Diva Attenborough, who's a science communicator and a PhD in science from Sydney too. So she hosted and kept us all on track. And we talked about, we were celebrating some queer scientists as part of this event, but we were also telling a very abridged story from the Big Bang till the extinction of the dinosaurs, and inviting the audience to create that soundscape with us. And here you can see that we have some singers with us. Alexis is with me, and we're sort of putting this on together. Now, with the strong caveat that Alexis, usually my partner in crime, is not here, the musical person here, I wanted to invite you to see if we might make a small atomic choir together. And I thought we'd stick with water. And I thought we'd stick with something quite simple with water, and we'd just think about the process of water boiling. So somebody's left the room, but there's still a few people in here. So I might invite you to make some sound and to try and leave any feeling of being silly at the door if you didn't already. And I invite you now to think about, so we're going to think about water molecules, but we're going to think about them in terms of being a group of water molecules interacting, as I showed in that diagram, through hydrogen bonding. So first of all, I think we need to try and think of either a sound, and I would let you know that, I should have let you know this already. We haven't been looking for melody in this project so far. That's something that we may develop or we may look into, but the idea is that this is a completely accessible entry point for people into any scientific topic, and equally a very accessible entry point into making sound or making collective sound together. And this is a little bit of an artificial scenario, but thanks for coming with me. So we're going to think about now if anyone would like to volunteer a sound that they associate with water. And this sound can be something that you make with a part of your body, it can be something you make with your mouth, or it can be just something that you think about when you think about water. So would anybody want to volunteer? A person at the back. Yeah, that's a great one. So to describe for anyone who's listening, it's sort of the sound that you make when you put your lips together and sort of pop them. Would that be a good? So would we mind making that collectively, the sound of water? Are you happy with that? Happy with that? Okay. Okay, so this is the sound of water. So this is water. We're thinking about liquid water at room temperature. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a heat source. So does anyone want to volunteer a sound that makes them think of something warm or something hot or something that would heat this water up? Okay, so we're going to try and make that sound together that Atia has volunteered. So does that feel warm enough to people? You happy with that one? So we'll put the two together. So we're going to need some people to carry on making the water sound and some people to make the heat sound. So we might go with water on this side and heat from Atia. Actually, we'll do it the other way because we need more water. So we'll do heat from this side and water from Atia over, if that's okay. So if we could start with the water. Okay, that's great. Okay, so there's another element that I'd like us to think about, no pun intended, and that is that between those water molecules, we're going to focus on those hydrogen bonds. So hydrogen bonds are things that happen between the hydrogen. They're intramolecular bonds between the hydrogen atoms and the oxygen atoms, and they occur because the oxygen is pulling more of the electrons in those bonds between hydrogen on each side. I'll be a water molecule for a second, and it's pulling more of the electrons towards it, so it's slightly negative. And because it's pulling those electrons away from the hydrogen, they're slightly positive. So it means that we have these slightly positive and slightly negative point charges that bind through these hydrogen bonding. And it's actually these intramolecular bonds that mean that water takes quite a lot of energy to boil, because we've got to break those bonds apart in order for the water to become a gas. So if anyone's feeling like they might have a sound for a hydrogen bond. So you could have both if you like, or you could maybe have a bit of try and put those together. Maybe we could have something, if we have an idea for something positive and something negative, we could put those together as a bond. So maybe a positive sound. Okay. Okay. Trust you, Karen. That's wonderful. Okay, so you're definitely the positive. Does anybody want to be negative and form a hydrogen bond with Karen? Yeah. Nobody wants to form this bond with you. Well, you could do both maybe. You could do and then you. Okay, so Karen's going to make the noise of the hydrogen bonds. You're going to be the water, and then it's going to be the heat. Now, what I'd also like us to think about too is I'd like the heat to sort of start off quiet and build up so it's a bit louder, to sort of emphasize that there's more heat getting into the water. And as this gets noisier, you're starting to get sort of more chaotic. You've got more energy. So you might want to get up and start moving around, okay? So that's what we're going to go for. And all the while, I'd like you to be making your hydrogen bond noise, okay? So we'll go with the water and the hydrogen bond to begin with. We're going to add some heat. It's getting louder. You're getting more energy. You're getting more and more energy. And the hydrogen bonds are going to break. And then suddenly the water is released as gaseous water vapor. Okay, so you get the picture. Thank you very much for indulging me. So this is something we play with, and we play with different aspects of this when we're creating these sounds. And depending on the number of people there, and if you're with a gifted conductor rather than a chemist who's pretending to be one, the sounds that we can create start to become very powerful and sort of consolidate these aspects. And I think you'll notice that some of these sounds sometimes end up staying with you and reminding you of aspects of these concepts too. So I'm going to finish up there. I just wanted to say thank you to our research group. This is a recent picture of the group, although some of our members have gone on to bigger and more brilliant things too now, but just so that you're familiar with some of the people in the team. And there's I think one or two new people since we've taken this photo, but they just started last week, so I haven't captured them yet. And just to thank again the Nanosonic Stories team and the Sydney Nano Institute for funding, also National Science Week funding, and a Westpac Research Fellowship that I've been really lucky to be awarded, which has enabled me to do lots of this work. And of course, to thank you all for your kind attention. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alice, and thanks for involving us in the Atomic Choir. We don't have a ton of time, but we'll go ahead and sit down here as is our wont with these events to address any questions. We have about 5 minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they want to add to the discussion?
I just have a comment, but it's really funny. I was thinking, Alice, while you were talking about the people that, like, I mean, they're totally unpaid and unfunded seemingly, but the people that, like, you know how there are people like on Twitter or social media who like make songs out of tweets that they see, like they'll see like I was just thinking that, you know, there's, I mean, it's very different because you're talking about, like, I love the, I forget the word you use for it, but I love the kind of like creation of sound effects, or what is the word?
Sonaphor?
The Sonaphor?
The Sonaphors. I love that so much. But I mean, but it's sort of like taking something that's, you know, in a very particular form and kind of like translating it into music. I just like, I love applying that idea like to science specifically.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Kelso.
Curious what, like, what is the most difficult concept or like that you've had making into a Sonaphor?
So I think so far, because we've been working on the dot points from the syllabus, in some ways they're the ideal place to start because they're so stripped back and simple, because they're you must teach this to the teachers, if that makes sense. So they were an easier place to start. One of the things we've started working on was a podcast with episodes interviewing different nanoscientists, and we wanted to create just one Sonaphor for the podcast that communicated a key concept that's part of their research. And one of the things that's most difficult is trying to work out, you know, what is, because there's often more than one fundamental concept, but what is a key concept? So for example, in working with Professor Anita Ho-Bailey, who's an expert in designing solar cells, like what scientific concept is the one you really need to understand how can you build solar cells, and why does the materiality of the solar cells so greatly change their capability of collecting and storing energy, right? And so I think that's been tricky. And then when there's sort of layered ideas, so I think it's probably less about the form and more about, in any way that you try and make a model or a simple diagram, you're always looking for how can I make this simpler? How can I take things away? And how can I still make this interesting? So I hope that answers your question, Kelso.
Do you have a question, Helen?
Yes. I just wanted to say, as someone with a slight visual tracking disability, I really appreciate what you're doing. But also, I was really curious about the role of verbal narrative in the segment about the atom that we listened to, because, you know, there's narration going on, and there's also kind of like a story being built, right? Both in the sense of we're shrinking ourselves down, like Mrs. Frizzle in Magic School Bus or something, and then we're coming back out, and also the acknowledgement that like the study of the atom has taken place for over so many years. So I'm really curious about the role that kind of narrative and narration plays in your project.
Thank you for your question. So I guess storytelling and narrative have been the thing I've focused on most as a science communicator, and particularly, you know, just finding the way in with someone. And it's, I hope I'm not terrible company at parties. I don't always talk about science, but just you realize that sometimes there's a way into almost anything, no matter what the topic. I'm not just talking about science. So thinking about how does that link into the person's story or the story they're telling, and how could you sort of extrapolate something out? So that was very, you know, very deliberate and very core to thinking about the Sonaphor and thinking about it more as a little story or a sonic metaphor, as we sort of described. And I think in terms of chemistry, I'm always drawn to trying to place these kind of abstract concepts within the real world in which we live, and hopefully not borrowing too much from some of the cliched ways that we do this, although of course there's plenty of cliche that can be used for good too. But thinking about, you know, the atom is something so abstract, and yet, you know, everything we see, everything we touch, everything we've ever loved is made of atoms, right? So it's also this beautiful concept too. And I think that idea of the using that sort of zooming in and zooming out, and the way that sound could help with that was really striking to me. And similarly, one of the things that I realized and hadn't kind of realized until we started the project is the sense, the temporal, the way that sound can be used to give a sense of space and movement in a way that we're sometimes restricted with a non-animated diagram. So I think also that lends itself to thinking about moving from place and moving into different zones, or kind of connecting it in that way. But thank you.
And I guess, we're running out of time, but I did want to say back to the sort of animal commentary about animal sounds translated across different languages. And I'm thinking of one other, kind of really memorable way that animal sounds were transposed into musical sounds, and that's Peter and the Wolf, of course, like the orchestra, where, like this animal is an oboe, this animal is, what have you. I don't remember it very well because I haven't listened to it since I was about like 12 years old or 10 years old. But I do find it interesting that we can, and wonder about, whether or not in your own project, beyond the voice, whether there are other instrumental noises or representational instrumental sounds that you may standardize across these different projects and ways of defining.
Yeah, I think with Harry coming on board and moving from the more acousmatic electronic design, although he's of course free to create things that sound like that using guitar or using different instruments, it's going to be interesting to see what voice the guitar has in this, and how it might differently characterize, the electron, or these characters as we think about them, and the sound object that would be attached to that character. And one thing that I think you're sort of alluding to, but if I'm wrong, you can correct me, is that we had thought about, could we create sort of a little bit like on a synthesizer or a programmable device. I'm losing my mind and I can't quite think of it. But sort of having buttons that are for like samples.
Like a MIDI device or something
sorry,
like that.
thank you. Like samples for different scientific concepts. So if you provided a suite of these different sounds, then a student in a classroom could, or a podcaster could create their own sound diagram or their own way of understanding or communicating something from these pre-composed sounds. So we're interested in people of all ages, but in the classroom, young people creating their own, because maybe that will help them to understand things or to understand the characteristics. And what I didn't do too much when I was conducting you in the Atomic Choir was to sort of challenge you to think about changing those sounds. That's usually the role that I have with Alexis. She's usually more towards the sound. And I'm sort of saying, that doesn't sound quite like this concept does to me. Can we make it a little bit louder, or the sound isn't quite right, if that makes sense. So we're thinking about creating that sort of suite of sounds, but also, of course, encouraging people to create their own too. So to try and have both aspects.
That's great. Well, please thank, once again, Dr. Alice Motion for spending time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.